I'm with Sheila Fitzpatrick, who is the founder of Fitzpatrick Associates. Now, Sheila, you've worked in data protection for a long while, and you've worked in over 160 countries, is that right?
That's correct, that's correct.
Wow. What differences do you see between different countries?
So for the most part, data protection laws are about 80% the same, where it's really all about that protection of an individual's fundamental right to privacy and the ethical use of data. But what we're seeing probably in the last 3 years as a result of some of the new legislation, the GDPR, some of the legislation in Asia Pacific, we're seeing more attention being paid towards enhancing privacy laws to move away from just looking at security to really looking at why do you need personal data, what is the point of having that data, and looking at the ethical and private use of the data. And so we're seeing laws really moving in that direction. And believe it or not, Asia Pacific is the fastest growing region in the world right now with the implementation of new privacy laws. Many of them modeled on GDPR, but some of them have even exceeded GDPR.
I'm hearing that a lot, that GDPR is now going further in other countries, South America as well. Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. So GDPR was initially supposed to be the gold standard. So everyone wanted to meet the requirements under GDPR. But while companies were burying their heads around GDPR, they weren't paying attention to what was going on in the rest of the world. So GDPR has now become the baseline where a lot of organizations, a lot of countries are looking at some of the, I'd say, holes within GDPR or some of the problems that companies are facing when they're dealing with GDPR, and they're either clarifying some of the definitions or enhancing the laws to fill some of those gaps. So Japan, for instance, achieved their adequacy rating under the EU in January, but more importantly, they actually assessed the EU to see whether or not GDPR made the requirements in terms of Japan. South America, certainly there's 15 countries in Latin America now that are implementing laws equal to or more excessive than GDPR. Mexico, Brazil is coming out with their new one, Costa Rica, Panama. Definitely we're seeing substantial changes around the world.
And you just mentioned about clarifying some of the definitions. Do you feel that GDPR did a good enough job of that? Or it definitely feels like there was some gaps where companies weren't sure what to do?
Well, I think GDPR, actually I'm a big proponent of GDPR because I'm passionate about privacy. I think some of the definitions were pretty clear. It was the interpretation of those definitions that became a problem. And you saw a lot, I saw, as many companies did, a lot of organizations and individuals who had never really operated in the privacy world sort of jump on that GDPR bandwagon, and so a lot of information that wasn't quite accurate was being spread, and so definitions were being convoluted, there was a lot of ambiguity, there was a lot of misinterpretation, and so I think a lot of that marketing collateral that claimed to be GDPR experts confused a lot of individuals on what things meant, like right to be forgotten is a perfect example, or right to erasure. People automatically thought that every piece of information you have on an individual has to be destroyed if someone exercises their right. Where the truth of the matter is, if you have a legal obligation to maintain that data, or a contractual obligation, you can't destroy it. But nobody talked about the records retention component of the right to be forgotten. So, and again, I think it just goes back to too many so-called experts trying to explain GDPR when they themselves didn't really understand it.
Now, you've worked with governments as well as organizations. So at what point did you start to see governments really say, this is something we care about?
Well, it's funny because governments are always a little bit slower because they always think that they're exempt from a lot of the regulations. But I think as we see governments moving into the smart city, smart nation concepts, and we're seeing citizens actually stand up and say, this new technology is great. We love the fact that you can help us with, finding where a parking space is, or knowing, what the best exit route on a highway, especially in the middle of a traffic jam, would be. But when it starts to infringe on that fundamental right to privacy, where you don't know what data the government's collecting on you, you don't know what it's being used for, and people are standing up and starting to say things and push back, is when government has actually stopped and thought, if we're going to have the trust of our citizens, we need to pay attention to privacy and start looking at privacy separately from security, because security is a given. Obviously, you have to protect that data. But if you don't have the legal right to have that data to begin with, what good is security going to do you? You need to look at that foundation first. And I think governments are starting to pay attention. GDPR also was a major impact on governments because they found out they weren't exempt. And so if you think about governments that do trade or tourism, or even universities that are part of the government industry or government sector, they're definitely impacted by many of the privacy laws, and so they can't bury their heads any longer.
And do you feel consumers, the public, do you feel they care, or do you think they're just happy with their smart cities?
I think they care, but I think when it comes to convenience, the default is, well, for convenience, I guess I'll let them have my data. But I think it's a lack of understanding, that individuals really don't understand what data they're giving up or what rights they're giving up and how their data is being used. Obviously, with Facebook and Google and some of the big companies that have had sanctions recently, people are starting to wake up to the fact that technology and innovation is great, but not when it absolutely infringes on that fundamental right to privacy. And so I think people are becoming much more aware of their rights, much more aware of the fact that they themselves own their personal data. No entity owns their personal data, and so they have to select what are they willing to give up, what are they willing to share, and the onus is on both the consumer and the companies that provide services and governments that provide services to consumers.
And if we look ahead to the coming 12 months, what do you think we're going to see happen or change?
Well, I think we're going to see a continued growth in the data protection, data privacy space. I'm hoping that at some point we're going to see a change of mindset where people realize that privacy is the foundation of what we do, and companies sort of back away from only talking about security and understanding that privacy is so critical, and you need to get your foundation of privacy right before you start introducing tools and technology to solve what is literally a compliance issue. And I see a lot of that companies, tremendous companies that build tremendous technology, but they were never privacy experts, and all of a sudden everyone has jumped on the GDPR and privacy bandwagon trying to sell solutions out of a box that don't exist. You're never going to solve privacy by buying compliance. And so I think in the next 12 months we're going to see people more aware of that and start to push back on suppliers and say, your tool is great and it does help one area of our compliance. Buying your tool is not going to make me compliant with GDPR or the Japanese Act on the Protection of Personal Information or the Canadian PIPEDA. So we're not going to see privacy stop in any ways. I think we're going to see it continue, and we're going to see more and more people, I think, jump on the bandwagon.
I love that. I love that take that privacy is where it starts, because actually it feels like everyone's doing it the other way around. Privacy is the top layer.
That's what everyone has always talked about, is that, it drives me crazy, and one of the things I'll talk about today is that when people say to me, well, we have world-class security, therefore we're compliant with privacy, and I literally want to slap them, because that's not the case. You have to deal with privacy first before you can even think about security. Security is all about locking down that data and protecting it from unauthorized access and use. But if you haven't thought about what data you're collecting, who you're collecting it from, why you're collecting it, what you're doing with it, if you're not being transparent and even defining what data do you need, because oftentimes organizations just collect tons of data, they don't necessarily need it, but they're great at locking it down. But that's fundamentally not going to help when you're talking about privacy. I always use the analogy of a bicycle wheel. Privacy is the wheel. It's the full life cycle of that personal data from the time you collect it to the time you destroy it. One spoke on that wheel is security. It's an extremely important spoke, but if you're only looking at that one spoke, that wheel's not going to turn. So, I talk a lot about the foundation of privacy, and I'm pretty passionate about it.
No, I could tell, and I love that. Well, thank you very much. That's been a really good take on the privacy issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.